Before tonight's horrors unfold, drop a comment and let us know where in the world you're tuning in from. Your support keeps the horrors alive. Let's begin. I try not to hate myself for what I've done. I keep telling myself that I'm not the first and surely won't be the last. There was simply no other choice. I was walking home after doing a bit of shopping, a bag of groceries in each hand. I am fortunate enough to live in a fairly walkable city, so I try to avoid driving as often as I can. Besides, the part of town I lived in was quite pleasant, and I enjoyed getting a bit of fresh air and some exercise. As I pondered what I was going to make myself for dinner that evening, absent-mindedly looking at various storefronts and signs that grabbed my attention, I suddenly collided with someone, my bags immediately falling to the ground. "Oh God, I'm so sorry," said the man I had bumped into, or had he bumped into me. He knelt down and began helping me pick up my groceries. Fortunately, nothing I had bought that day was especially breakable. Otherwise, I would have been much more irritated. He was a college student, perhaps. He definitely had the rather ragged appearance of an overworked academic. Dark bags under his eyes, unshaven stubble, and an ill-fitting tweed coat with patches on the elbows. He seemed to be trembling, as if he were afraid of something. At the time, I just assumed he was anxious after our little collision. He kept apologizing too, mumbling, I'm sorry," over and over again, as he picked up the various foodstuffs that had been scattered across the pavement. "It's all right, I should have looked where I was going," I insisted, examining a box of crackers to make sure it wasn't crushed too badly before placing it back into the bag. The man handed me the other bag of groceries and I thanked him. As we both stood up, he looked at me dead in the eyes and said, "I'm sorry, don't keep it too long." Before I could ask him what he meant by this, he took off running into the crowd, and I was left standing on the sidewalk, puzzled. I arrived home about 15 minutes after my encounter with the man on the sidewalk and began putting away my groceries in the pantry. About halfway through this process, however, I found something odd at the bottom of one of the bags, the one the man had handed to me. I pulled the object out of the bag, staring at it, puzzled. It appeared to be nothing more than a smooth, flat stone. It was shiny and polished and was around the size and shape of a half-dollar coin. It was unusually cool to the touch. As I held the stone up to the light, I noticed some faint, barely discernible symbols on its surface, but they didn't appear to be carved or painted on. Instead, it seemed as if they were a part of the structure of the rock itself, like the cross-section of a fossil. I'm not much of an expert on languages, and I never did manage to identify any of the symbols on it, but I suppose they look vaguely like the letters of ancient Greek, perhaps, though even that is a loose comparison at best. I'll be honest, I had no idea what to think at the time. I assumed it must have been some sort of viral marketing campaign or social media trend of some sort. I set the stone down on the counter and finished packing up the groceries, forgetting about it. I made myself a simple dinner of some vegetable fried rice and watched a movie before getting ready for bed. I brushed my teeth, made my bed, and turned off all the lights in the house, double-checking that the doors and windows were all shut and locked as I did so. This is very important. It must be understood that I always make sure that my doors and windows are securely locked before I go to bed. I've always been a bit paranoid, and even though I live in a fairly crime-free neighborhood, I still worry about burglars. When I was satisfied that my home was suitably impervious to intruders, I began to change out of my day clothes into some pajamas. As I was removing my pants, I felt something strange bulging in my left pocket. I reached in and pulled out the stone, smooth and cool against my hand, glinting slightly in the light of my bedside lamp. That's strange, I thought to myself. I could have sworn I left this on the counter. I must have picked it up without thinking about it. I set it down on the bedside table, feeling a little unnerved. Everyone occasionally forgets where they've put something, only to find they were carrying it with them all along. But this was different. I distinctly remembered setting it down on the kitchen counter. Regardless, I managed to drift off to sleep with the aid of a melatonin tablet and a little bit of The Midnight Man horror stories playing softly in the background. I've always been a light sleeper, so I usually have to have some faint sound or some horror stories to listen to when I go to bed in order to avoid waking up at every creak and groan of my house settling. I woke up at around 12 to the sound of footsteps coming from inside the house. I live alone, and my house doesn't share any walls with anyone else, so it couldn't have been me hearing a neighbor getting up for a midnight snack. I don't keep any pets either. I shot up in bed listening intensely, trying to gauge where the sound was coming from. I turned off YouTube to make sure I could hear properly. All was silent for a few painful moments, and I worried that I may have simply imagined it. But then I heard it again, the slap of bare feet against wood. I grabbed the flashlight I kept in the drawer of the bedside table and began to creep through the house. The flashlight was the sort that was designed for use in self-defense, with a strobe setting and sharp protrusions at the front. It wasn't much, but I felt a little safer having it in my hands. I crept slowly through the house, aiming the flashlight's beam at every corner. In retrospect, I'm not entirely sure why I didn't just lock the door to my room and call the police. That would have been the logical thing to do in my situation, but I don't think it would have helped much even if I had. I followed my ears whenever I heard the footsteps recur, eventually making my way to the living room. I'll admit it, I come from a somewhat wealthy family and as a result live in a fairly nice house. The living room is large and open, with a polished hardwood floor, high ceiling, and sliding glass doors that reveal my backyard. The moonlight shone in from outside, illuminating the room dimly, but there was nobody there. And yet, as I stood there, warily shining the flashlight around the room, I heard once again the slapping of bare feet on wood, coming closer to me. I began to panic, spinning around and flailing the flashlight about wildly, trying to get a glimpse of whoever was coming towards me. There was nobody that I could see. The footsteps came closer and closer, louder until it felt like they were almost right next to me, when I suddenly noticed something else. The footsteps were coming from above me. Trembling with fear, I shakily looked upwards towards the wood-paneled ceiling, guiding the beam of light to follow my gaze. That's when my flashlight abruptly went out. I shrieked with terror and rushed for the light switch, flicking it on quickly. The chandelier-styled light fixture turned on, illuminating the room in an instant. There was nothing there. I spent the rest of the night wandering through the house, turning on every light I could find, searching every nook and cranny for any sign of an intruder. Predictably, I didn't find anything out of the ordinary. By the time the sun rose, I was exhausted and wished very much I could just go back to sleep. I was still tired when I began my walk to work, yawning frequently as I pushed through the crowd on my way to the office. The day was a little bit foggy, but not so much that I couldn't see, though it did seem strange for the season. I could make out my immediate surroundings just fine, but some distant objects were a little harder to discern. As I sluggishly put one foot in front of the other, fantasizing vaguely about my office's free coffee, I noticed something odd out of the corner of my eye. It looked like some sort of banner hanging from a street lamp in the distance. I couldn't see it too well with the unusual fog, but something about it seemed wrong. As I got closer, I started to question whether it was a banner at all. There was certainly something hanging from the street lamp, but it wasn't flapping in the breeze, and it seemed much too bulky to be fabric. Even though I couldn't make out what it was at this distance, something about it caused me to feel deeply uneasy. A chill ran up my spine as though I were being watched. I felt like I was just about to make out the strange shape hanging down from the street lamp when suddenly a large bus blocked my line of sight, disgorging its passengers onto the sidewalk like a stream of rats fleeing a sinking ship. By the time I successfully made my way through the crowd of similarly exhausted commuters, whatever object had been hanging there was gone. I rubbed my eyes, beginning to worry that I was imagining things. I slipped my hands into my pockets to keep them warm and felt a smooth, cool object brush against my left hand. I pulled out the stone from my pocket and stared at it, standing still in the middle of the sidewalk. I didn't remember taking it off my bedside table that morning. I once again felt that prickling, uncomfortable feeling of being watched, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I shoved the stone back in my pocket and continued on my way back to the office, trying to focus on the promise of free fresh coffee and ignore my mounting paranoia. Work was largely uneventful, and the fog had cleared up by the time I made my way home in the late afternoon. I felt immensely tired despite the massive quantity of caffeine I had consumed, and thought I might retire to bed early that evening. Nevertheless, I had some chores to do, so went about my business vacuuming, organizing, and otherwise cleaning up the place. I wasn't going to let a lack of sleep get in the way of maintaining a well-ordered home. By the time I was finished with my chores and had eaten some leftovers for dinner, it was a little after 8 o'clock, and I felt like I was now justified in getting ready for bed. As with the night previous, I double-checked to make sure every door and window in the house was locked and secure. I still felt a little paranoid after hearing the footsteps the night before, so I also did another quick sweep of the entire house to make absolutely sure nobody was there with me, that I was entirely alone. I feel a little embarrassed to admit this, but I even carried around a claw hammer with me while I checked, just in case I needed to defend myself. However, as with last night, there was nothing unusual to be found, and I let myself relax just a little bit. I was getting ready to shower before bed, looking over my face in the mirror, when the paranoia abruptly returned in full force. It was very sudden, as though a switch had been flipped. 1 second I was observing my skin for blemishes, and the next I was absolutely dead certain that I was being watched. It felt like I had suddenly been dunked into a tub of ice water, and I began shaking intensely. It took me a moment to realize what had set me off, the stimulus that had triggered my fear before my brain had even consciously processed it. Looking into the mirror, I saw that just above the edge of the closed shower curtain, touching the ceiling, were a pair of bare feet, the legs obscured by the curtain itself. It looked as if someone was standing, upside down on the ceiling. The skin of the feet was a mottled gray color, like that of something that had been dead and floating in the stagnant water for days. The stench of rot, previously unnoticed, began to flood my nose. Panicking, I grabbed the heaviest object within sight, a glass bottle of hand soap, and braced myself to pull back the curtain. My plan was to hit the intruder with the bottle as hard as I could before running outside and having a neighbor call the police. I was naked, but I'd much rather get in trouble for some public indecency than be murdered by some hand-standing stranger in my own home. I took several deep breaths, counting down from 10 in my head, before rushing toward the shower, pulling back the curtain, and yelling as I swung the bottle down towards where I assumed the intruder's head would be. The bottle smashed on the back wall of shower, spraying into 100 shards of glass. There was nobody there. I looked around the bathroom frantically, but there was no sign of anyone else in the room. I collapsed down to the floor and began to cry. I wasn't able to get to sleep that night. The next day at work was incredibly stressful. After what I had seen, combined with 2 nights in a row of no sleep, I was a nervous wreck. I jumped whenever I received a notification from my email, and nearly screamed when my supervisor came up behind me and asked me how my work was coming along. I was riddled with intense paranoia, constantly looking behind me and refusing even to go to the bathroom out of an intense fear of being left alone. Unfortunately, due to my intense anxiety, I wasn't exactly an efficient worker. I won't go into the boring details of my job, but there were a couple of tasks that I absolutely had to finish before I went home, and by the time the shift was over, I had still not completed them. My coworkers all shuffled off home, while I was left alone, sitting at my desk. It took me about an hour after I was supposed to have gone home to finish up the bare minimum of work I needed to get done. It shouldn't have taken me that long to finish my work, but the whole time I felt like I was being watched, that even though I was the only person in the office, I wasn't actually alone. I rubbed the stone in one hand to try and calm myself as I reviewed the work I had just finished, making sure it was of at least somewhat acceptable quality. I didn't remember bringing the stone with me to work, but I had found it sitting on my desk regardless. Satisfied I would at the very least not get fired for the work I had done, I submitted it to my manager's email and turned off my computer, getting up to leave. The office I work at is one of those fancy open-floor, plan-type setups with lots of windows and bright colors to try and cheer up the employees. It was renovated once the executives decided it was time for the workers to come back into the office again as the pandemic waned, perhaps in some desperate attempt to make people voluntarily give up the comforts of working from home. Regardless, the most important thing to know about the place where I work is that it has very tall ceilings, maybe 30 feet or so. As I was walking out of the office, I felt something wet drip onto my face. I touched my hand to the dampness, drawing back a finger-stained red. Blood. I looked up at the ceiling to find bloody footprints, 30 feet in the air, as if someone were walking on the ceiling. They were leading the direction I had just came from. I retraced my steps, following the bloody footprints to see where they led. I was in a daze, the stress from the past couple of days combined with my intense tiredness, resulting in a kind of numbness. Just minutes before I had been jumpy, nervous, ready to flee at the slightest sound. And now I was following the very source of my terror. The footprints terminated in the main office space, directly above my desk. There was no sign of whatever had created them. I had no idea how long it had been standing up there, looking down at me while I worked. I pulled my phone out from my purse and tried to take a picture of the bloody footprints on the ceiling, but when I peered at the screen, there was nothing there. I looked up from my phone, and sure enough, the footprints were gone. I felt like I was going crazy. I practically ran home after work, desperate to get back to my house before it was dark. I didn't want to be alone on the streets when the sun went down. The last rays of sunlight were beginning to dissipate as I slammed shut my front door and began to cry. After I had sufficiently calmed down and the tears were no longer blocking my vision, I once again went through the ritual of checking to make sure all the doors and windows in the house were secure. Though at this point, I was beginning to feel as though it was a waste of time. I didn't bother doing any chores or even eating dinner. I simply took a triple dose of melatonin and secured the bedroom as best as I could, desperate to get at least one good night of sleep. I believed that I could find a solution, figure out some way forward, if only I could get a little bit of rest. On the bedside table, I set down the flashlight, the largest kitchen knife I owned, and my wallet and car keys, just in case I had to leave in a hurry. Feeling more tired than I ever had before, I tucked myself into bed fully clothed and quickly began to drift off to sleep, despite my fear. After 2 sleepless nights in a row, I didn't have the willpower to stay awake any longer. As my eyelids began to close, the last thing I saw was the view from my bedroom window, peering out across the street. My neighbor's light was on, and in their window I saw the silhouette of something hanging from their ceiling, staring back at me. I was too tired to force my eyes open any longer, and I fell abruptly into a deep sleep. Whenever I take more than my usual dose of melatonin, I have bad dreams, and that night was no exception. In my nightmare, I found myself falling upwards into the night sky, gravity seemingly reversed for me. I looked down at the rapidly vanishing lights of the city I lived in, desperately grasping at the air for anything to stop my rapid ascent. I screamed at the top of my lungs for help, crying out that the air was too thin and I couldn't breathe. I woke up with a jolt, clutching the stone intensely in my left hand. I distinctly remembered leaving it in my purse. The first rays of morning shone down upon my face, and I looked across the street again, blinking away the daylight. The silhouette in my neighbor's window was gone. I called out sick from work and walked down to the nearby park, still clutching the stone in my left hand. The park was a regular destination of mine, and I didn't even need to think about the route I took to get there. It had a variety of paths and trails which I had all lovingly explored one time or another. But I had a different destination in mind that particular morning. There was a small lake near the center, upon which one could fish and rent small paddle boats. I gripped the stone even tighter as I marched purposefully towards my goal. It was another foggy morning, and the lake was shrouded in a thick mist. I couldn't see the opposite shore from the beach where I stood, gazing out over the still water. Transferring the stone into my right hand, I took a deep breath, calming myself before skipping it across the water as hard as I could. The near-perfect smoothness and circular shape of the stone made it ideal for skipping, and it hopped across the water once, twice, 3 times before finally sinking with a faint plop. I turned to leave, satisfied that the task I had set out to do was complete, before I heard a sound from the lake behind me. It was the distinctive sound of a stone skipping across water. I looked back at the lake to find the stone flying towards me, landing at my feet with a slight clatter as it hit the pebbles that made up the beach. I bent down and picked the stone back up again, slipping it into my pocket. I felt numb. My only hope was finding the man who had slipped me the stone in the first place. If he couldn't stop what was happening to me, he could at least explain what was going on. I hated him for what he had done. I hated him for cursing me to be followed by this inexplicable thing, for handing me this stone that seemed impossible to get rid of. As I walked down the streets of the city, I wondered what it was that was following me exactly. Was it a ghost, a demon, or something else? I'd never gotten a good look at the thing, just its mottled gray feet and the vague, human outline of someone standing upside down upon the ceiling, staring at me. It was almost stupid, comical even, but regardless of how utterly bizarre it was, just the thought of seeing that thing filled me with an intense, palpable dread. As I looked around the crowds of pedestrians desperately trying to seek out the man who had brought all this upon me in the first place, I kept thinking that I saw it everywhere I looked. Was that it, hanging from the awning of that office building's window? Or there, walking on the underside of the overpass, was it coming closer to me? Perhaps I saw it through the glass display of a clothing store, glaring at me as it stood on the ceiling above a faceless display mannequin. Yet whenever I tried to get a closer look, to confirm what I thought I saw, it was gone. I was so distracted by my paranoid terror that I didn't even see the old woman when I bumped into her, sending her sprawling across the sidewalk. She looked to be homeless, carrying plastic bags filled with cans and bottles to be turned in for money at the local recycling plant. She swore at me, telling me to watch where I was going, and I apologized profusely as I began helping her off the ground. On instinct, I started to help gather up her fallen cans and bottles, putting them back into the plastic bags that had been dropped. As I did so, a thought suddenly occurred to me, a thought that I regret. I pulled the stone out from my pocket and slipped it into the bag with the cans before handing it back to the woman. She accepted it with a mumbled "thank you," and I locked eyes with her for a moment, gazing at her wrinkled face with an expression of deep remorse upon my own. "I'm sorry," I said. "Don't keep it too long."